Kerrville, Texas, on September 21st, 1995, Scott Panetti was convicted of murdering his in-laws, Joe and Amanda Alvarado, and was sentenced to death. Prior to the crime, Scott Panetti had a 10-year history of mental illness, including more than a dozen stays in psychiatric institutions. Scott is schizophrenic and was unmedicated at the time of the crimes.
I'm Yvonne Panetti. I'm the mother of Scott Panetti. Scott, as a child, was terrific. He was sweet and easy to deal with. He just was a lovely child.
He had his bigger brother he always followed around, you know, and between the two of them they kept us, mother and I, pretty active. And when the boys were small, they would go with me on a lot of jobs where I could take them, you know. And they were always real active and good helpers. Bought a small, kind of a hobby farm, I guess you'd call it, just to get the kids away from the city and give them a country life like I had.
I was 4 years old, and he would always, you know, goof around with me and play with me. And he was a good brother, but, you know, that was before he started showing signs of sickness or schizophrenia.
But I can remember going downstairs. He was laying on the bed, and he had his hands like this. And he's just looking, just staring in space. And I went in there, and I said, Scott, you acted like you're listening to something. Did you have your music on? He said, it's just the music in my head. He seemed to be drawing away from us. And I thought, well, maybe he'll grow out of this. It was his teenage silliness, you know.
He just completely, personality was you could see it was changing. Some days he'd be great. Half the time he didn't seem like the same kid, you know.
I was 18 or 19 when he would call the radio station in Fredericksburg, Texas, and I hadn't seen him in a long time, and he kept calling and saying, "This is Sarge. Why won't you play my song? You know, this is Sergeant Ranahan Iron Horse here," and he kept calling over and over until they played his song. And that's when I really realized that he was really getting sick, because that he really thought that he was another person.
In 1986, Scott developed the delusion that the devil was out to get him. He buried his valuables in the dirt and washed his walls and furniture to exorcise the devil from his home.
So it got so bad with several incidents that we had him committed. We had him arrested one time, just picked up. And from then on, it just kept getting worse.
He was allowed to come home. And he was helping his dad, but he was just like a zombie when he'd help Jack milk or whatever. He just would go through the motions.
Had him evaluated, different doctors, different psychiatrists, and they all come up pretty much with the same thing, basically schizophrenia. And after we found this out, you know, we could kind of put things together. It's been coming on for quite some time. And that's about it. Next thing I know, I'm on the job, and the foreman stopped me, the boss, superintendent. "Jack," he said, "you got a phone call, you got to call home right away." And that's when Scott was held up after he shot the Alvarados. I went back to the job and I told Mother, I said, "You want me to come home?" She says, "No, there ain't no sense of coming home right now." So I went back just to get it off my mind. Got back on the machine and I kept it going. That's pretty much what I've been doing ever since.
Before the murder, Scott had crudely shaved his head, and afterward he put on a suit, and turned himself over to the Gillespie County Police.
I'm Mary Dahl Solbrig, and I am licensed to practice law in the state of Texas. I've been practicing here in Fredericksburg since 1985. I was retained by Scott's parents. At one point, he qualified for SSI through Social Security based on his disabilities. I was his representative payee. I don't think you have to have a PhD in psychiatry or an MD or a PhD in psychology. You know that he is not a very rational person. But I think he mentally deteriorated over the time period that I've known him for about 20 years.
My name is Preston Douglas. I was Scott's primary appointed attorney in 1992. My interviews with Scott were lengthy and numerous over 2 or 3 years, in things like being spoken to from voices and visited in dreams, and other beings being involved with Scott, from some celestial or old cowboys talking to him in his sleep. Those sort of things were fairly common. When you would show up for court, you never knew which Scott Panetti was going to show up to court with you. I was first appointed to represent Scott in September of 1992 and ultimately was discharged by Scott in June of 1995.
He had fired his lawyers out of paranoia. He thought they were out to get him.
He thought that they were in cahoots with Fredericksburg police. He truly believed that. We tried so hard to get him not to fire any attorney he fired. We tried to get him not to do it.
Scott had been my highest priority for 3 years. And to see him make that decision that I knew was rooted in mental illness, and make that decision and a decision that I knew would ultimately lead to him perhaps getting the ultimate penalty was painful.
Scott Panetti's case went to trial on August 21st, 1995. Judge Stephen Abels allowed Scott to act as his own attorney. Scott Monroe was appointed to be Mr. Panetti's standby counsel. Mr. Monroe did not sit with Mr. Panetti at the counsel table and was only permitted to provide the help Mr. Panetti specifically asked for.
So when I initially got appointed, I was trying to give Scott as much resource material as I could give him without me, again, violating what I had been ordered to do, which not inject myself into his case any more than he wanted me to. So I made him a copy of the Code of Criminal Procedure, and I highlighted the capital murder sections. I'd copied off some articles from seminars, from capital murder seminars. I had copied all of his file for him. And I gave all this to Scott at the jail, only to find out that over the next few weeks, it seems like, he mailed it all out. He got rid of all of it, sent it to his sister Vicki, because Scott was convinced that the jailers were coming into his cell and going through his file and looking at his correspondence, and he didn't want them to have access to all of that. So Scott sent it out.
One time, Scott sent me locks of his hair that he had cut off in with all the legal papers, and told me that this is the hair of God's soldier. So I opened an envelope, and out came hair and papers that were written all over with all kinds of symbols. And he would draw cartoons and jokes on his legal documents and the paperwork.
Scott's family sat through the entire trial. They passed Scott notes and tried to help him with his case.
We'd send him a note and say, show those medical records. You know, he was up there by himself. I said, show the medical records. Well, Scott would be up there scribbling, drawing pictures on them, and then he'd finally get it up to the judge. The judge would say, I can't accept that. You scribbled on it. Throw it out.
The trial of Scott Panetti was, to me, a circus, and I think that other people saw it that way as well.
He was more obsessed with how he looked and his fantasy of being his own lawyer in a 1930s cowboy costume than what reality was, and that was that he was under trial for murder. He didn't understand that.
It would have been like an old Hollywood cowboy movie. It's nothing that anybody would wear to anything other than a costume party. It was bizarre.
Can you imagine pants tucked into these tall boots? I was embarrassed for him, for that outfit he was wearing.
That's what's happened in the freak shows of the previous century. You know, you pay a nickel to go and watch somebody dress up and act like a jackass, and it's really disgusting to think that my dad was allowed to walk into the court of law in a cowboy suit. That seems really like a disgusting thing. You know, like people got a kick out of looking and laughing about somebody who's sick.
Scott's vernacular was something that sounded like it came out of a Western movie. Runaway mule, a flatiron you. And so he talked like he was a cowboy. And he'd ask questions using those phrases. He would intertwine them in his comments to the judge.
He was out of his mind. He subpoenaed Jesus Christ, Anne Bancroft, and John F. Kennedy to come to his trial.
Scott called witnesses just to visit with them. He had no line of questioning. He didn't know what he was doing.
I remember Scott putting a couple of witnesses on, and it was kind of like, hey, what'd you guys do last week? Been fishing? You know, kind of going, well, Scott, we're a little off the subject here. Why do you have this witness here? What are they going to talk about? And it was just kind of an opportunity for Scott to say hi to somebody, and so he put him on the stand and let him go.
I was subpoenaed along with the world. When I did, in fact, testify, the questions he posed to me had nothing to do with his case or his mental health condition. Among other things, he wanted to know from me under oath, had we ever had a sexual or an intimate relationship? That question made him, in my opinion, only look ridiculous.
Some days Scott appeared to be very attentive and listened to the testimony that was going on. On other days, Scott would sit at the counsel table and put his head on the desk, and at any given moment I couldn't tell whether he was awake or asleep.
Because Scott would sit there like this. He'd put his head down, and he'd think and think. And I thought, what is he doing, waiting for a voice to tell him what to ask? Is he waiting for the voices?
I thought the first day that the judge was going to stop it, I said to my wife, I said, he won't let this go on, you know. I mean, Scott, anyone can see the way he was dressed and the way he was acting. No judge in his right mind will hold a trial like this. And it went on. It went on.
To some people, it looked like a circus and it looked comical. To me, it was incredibly sad and it was terrifying because I knew the effect he was having on those jurors.
At the very end, he called Sergeant Ranahan to testify. Which is him, which is Scott. And he got up on the stand and he sort of went into a trance.
Just like Sarge was talking right through Scott's mouth. His voice was not Scott's. And my wife and I just about passed out right there.
I'll tell you what, if this was made into a movie, nobody would believe it.
An alter ego of mine, Sarge, who I made this painting of, killed my in-laws. And there's no treatment as far as the new medicine Cozaril for schizophrenia to help me to become just what I am here.
His trial was a joke. I don't believe he should have ever been allowed to represent himself. And I think he knew that. He recognized that early on. I think he felt like he was a lamb being led to slaughter.
But I don't think a trial at which a person's life at stake should ever be allowed to be conducted like Scott's trial was allowed to be conducted. And for that reason, it was perverse.
After he got the sentencing, we just sat there. We couldn't move, none of us. We were just in shock, just sitting there. And we couldn't believe that all that could have took place.
I've lost a lot of faith in the justice system, and I've lost a lot of faith even in my country. I can't believe that they let this happen, you know, in the United States.
The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, and on September 22nd, 1995, Scott Panetti was sentenced to death.
My mom and dad got divorced. I think I was 4 or 5 years old. And so most of the memories I have are of this big superhero guy, like a kid thinks of their dad. I was 2 feet tall and he was 6'5", and just a bigger-than-life character. I'm 26 now, and I've recently developed a relationship with him, and there was just something about a year ago I felt like I needed to go and meet this person and know this person in case something were to happen. I would know him based on the person that I met, not the person that I had heard about. And he believes he is on a mission and that he is fulfilling his purpose, doing what he was intended to do with his life in prison by, letting people know that they can achieve eternal life through a relationship with God.
That's why they call him the preacher on death row, because he preaches to a lot of the new guys that come in that are very scared.
Boy, if I were to have to tell a stranger about my dad, or if somebody learned who he was and that I was his son, I'd say that provided he is living with a mental illness, I think that he exhibits great strength.
Since before his trial, Scott Panetti has refused all medicine to treat his schizophrenia. Scott contends that on April 1st, 1995, angels visited him in his prison cell and cured him of his mental illness. In the past 10 years, Scott's condition has deteriorated significantly.
I'm Mark Cunningham. I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist in private practice. I was asked to evaluate Mr. Scott Panetti. First, he exhibited disorganized thought processes and speech, which is pretty typical of somebody who is actively schizophrenic or actively psychotic. He exhibited flight of ideas, which means that his train of thought jumped from one subject to another without any clear connection between them. He exhibited tangentiality, which means that he would begin talking about one thing and then go off into lots of other things. Those are the sorts of disorganization of thought symptoms that are often observed in somebody who is actively schizophrenic.
My name is Seth Silberman. I'm a clinical and forensic psychiatrist. From a clinician's point of view, I would say he was paranoid, he was delusional. So basically a grossly psychotic, paranoid individual who did not appear to be medicated, who seemed to have a pure psychiatric disorder, and it's pretty severe. It's rare that I've seen someone that sick. He has a pretty significant history of severe chronic paranoid schizophrenia. That's rampant through the chart. Usually you see a lot more inconsistency in terms of diagnosis. It's very clear to me that he has a chronic paranoid schizophrenia, and it's severe.
From 1981 to 1992, Scott Panetti was hospitalized in over a dozen psychiatric institutions. His medical records from this period are hundreds of pages long. An evaluation of competency in the state of Texas is guided by Article 46.05H in the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure. The statute states that a defendant is incompetent to be executed if the defendant does not understand that he or she is to be executed and that the execution is imminent, and the reason he or she is being executed.
I'm John Bloom. I'm the director of the Cornell Death Penalty Project. I have studied a number of cases in which there have been allegations of incompetency to be executed. I've written law review articles in the field and conducted a national empirical study. Based on everything I've read and I've reviewed, I think that Mr. Panetti is clearly incompetent. This case is a travesty of justice. In fact, this train which is leading to his execution is one which should have never left the station. I believe he was incompetent to stand trial. The trial itself is a mockery of justice, but over the years his condition has continued to deteriorate.
The death penalty, I think, is wrong for my dad, because if he were to be put to death, he's not going to comprehend that he's being executed because he did something wrong. He thinks that he's being executed by evil powers that want to prevent him from preaching the message of Jesus Christ.
I think he truly believes that this started a long time ago with the devil, and that the devil doesn't want him to preach God's word.
His belief is that the primary reason this is being carried out is to prevent him from preaching the gospel. And that is obviously a delusional perception that is a product of a diseased mind, that's a product of his schizophrenia spectrum disorder.
The death penalty was not designed for people like Scott Panetti. I mean, normally when you think about the death penalty, you think about it having two purposes. One is retribution, the other is deterrence. Well, clearly you can't deter people who are schizophrenic and who are so severely mentally ill that they don't understand that there's something wrong with firing their lawyer and representing themselves in a cowboy suit. As for retribution, normally we think of the death penalty as being reserved for the worst of the worst offenders. And that takes into account two things. Not only did they commit the worst crimes, but are they the worst people? Are they the most morally culpable? And executing someone like Scott Panetti, who there's no question this person is a severely mentally ill, schizophrenic person, and by definition that means they are not the worst of the worst.
If you're a parent and you're going to let your child know that they did something wrong, there has to be an association with what the wrongdoing was and the action and the punishment and everything like that. And if that's not there, what's the point? You know, it's like if you just implement your discipline and there's no understanding as to why it's being implemented, then what's the point?
In Ford versus Wainwright, Justice Powell wrote that for the death penalty to meet its retributive goals, it requires, quote, the defendant's awareness of the penalty's existence and purpose.
There's something morally wrong and reprehensible about executing someone who is so mentally ill that they don't understand that they are the nature and purpose of the death penalty.
When it's time to go, when I'm there and I'm visiting my dad, and the guard comes and tells you that it's time to go. It's been 2 hours. It's hard to leave, you know, mainly just because, you know, it's I know it's going to be a really long time before I get to come back, probably 3 or 4 months usually. And then on the drive home, you know, you really start to think about, you know, you wonder if he'll get to go outside and exercise the next day, or if he'll get to do the little things that he looks forward to, you know. It's hard to know that he's going back there, for sure, because he's done paintings of what he sees when he looks out of his window. And for a while, then, you know, he was just looking out at another concrete wall, you know, and another bunch of little windows. Now he's described that he's very lucky to be able to look out and see cows and stuff like that a guy has right next to the prison, and that's big for him because, you know, when he can look out and see cows and stuff, he remembers when, you know, he was just a normal kid helping his dad out on the farm.
I like to tell people that it's like having a family member with a terminal illness having him on death row, because it's like expecting him to die. It's coping with the fact that he's going to die.
Where I see the punishment being dealt out is I see my grandma and my grandpa. I see them being punished knowing that they're going to lose a son, or I see her being punished when she thinks about him being in there with people that hate him. The death penalty isn't something that they're going to do to Scott Panetti. The death penalty is something that they're doing to his family.
Mother and I ain't got long to go, you know. What the hell, if we live 10 years, it'll be luck. But if something happens to Scott and we're still alive, we can probably hold it together. But after that, I don't know.
I don't pray one way or the other. I just say, God, you know, I want him to live, but please know that I'll accept whatever you determine is going to happen to him.